You're watching the video lesson titled Reporting with PowerCLI. It's part of a previously recorded video series titled VMware vSphere Pro, and we've decided to include it with the VMware PowerCLI course because of its importance and the relevance of reporting to day-to-day administration. This lesson has two parts. In part one, I'll be talking to you about how to create a great report. This includes how to define your audience. Then I'll cover how to determine the requirements for your report. As a part of that, we'll be going over several output formats which you may want to use for your reports. Next, I'll talk about some actions that you can take with a completed report. Then I'll talk about the importance of interpreting data and some methods you can use to do so on your own reports. Afterwards, we'll hit on one of my personal favorites, automation. Next, I'll talk about when it makes sense to use PowerCLI for generating reports. And for the last piece of part one, I'll show you some PowerShell and PowerCLI techniques that can be used to create reports. For part two, I've created a few example reports. We'll go through the requirements for each of these, and then I'll explain the PowerShell code you need to gather the data and produce the reports. Report 1 is going to be host inventory. Report 2, virtual machine inventory. And report 3, storage utilization. Okay, let's talk about creating great reports. Before we get started, let me explain some product positioning with ESXi and how this relates to reporting. With Virtual Center, using that with ESXi, you've got very good feature parity with ESX. Without Virtual Center, if you are using ESXi during the trial period, you haven't assigned a license to it, you have full functionality. However, once you obtain a license from VMware, which you have to do within the first 60 days, I believe, and assign that license, you actually lose some functionality. PowerCLI then reverts to, the API that allows you to work with ESXi, it reverts to a read-only mode. PowerCLI, vCLI, other things that use that same API, they are all restricted to that read-only access. So that's something to bear in mind. However, most reporting scenarios fit just fine with that read-only access. So think about what you're doing during reporting, right? You're just pulling data out in order to produce, the data in a meaningful format for you. This works fine with read-only access, so it's not something you generally have to worry about. If you've got a small shop and you're using the free hypervisor, you shouldn't really have to worry about it. You can still do plenty of interesting reporting scenarios with that. Now let's talk about how to create great reports. I have 4 main points to make in the following several slides. The first one is define your audience. We're going to talk about this again in more detail later on, but I wanted to have this up front for you guys to look at. Define the audience. This is talking about who is your report for, what is appropriate for this particular level of person. Number 2, define the requirements. You need to make sure that you know what you need to be delivering up front so that when you've delivered it, you know how good of a job you've done, whether you've met your objectives. Interpret the data. We're going to talk about what this means. Basically, I want to make sure that you don't just spit things out. Apply some intelligence to it, add some value. And automate the report. This is going to be key for us engineers, right? We want to make things efficient, repeatable, and I'm going to give you some tips on how you can do that. Okay, first, let's talk about the audience. When designing a report, you want to make sure that you are tailoring the content to the needs of the person who receives it. I've divided potential audience here into 3 segments: engineer, manager, and executive. Now, the engineer is going to need the detail. If you are an engineer and you're producing a report for your peers, they're going to see this report as something that leads directly to action on their part. They're going to need to know all of the input. They're going to need to know everything that they possibly can, and you're going to want to think of the end result. What does this mean for me? It means, I need input to go into a work order or a change request, that type of thing. Next up, manager. Managers need to have some level of detail. They need to have definitely supporting detail, but they're going to need summaries. So you're going to want to break things into pieces and think of basically you're providing your manager with an answer. Here's a problem I have. Here is the detail that supports the conclusion that I'm telling you to draw. And finally, executive. Executives do not want to see the detail. They don't have time for the detail. They are trusting that their management chain has already validated the detail. You are basically providing this executive with facts and as little detail behind it as possible. So think bullet points. So I've got a little picture here to kind of show that relationship to you. This is important. Keep this in mind. For the purposes of this video, however, I'm really kind of focused on the engineer and the manager levels. So you'll see that the reports that we'll be generating later on are going to have a good level of detail to them. Now we're going to talk about requirements. It's really important to nail down your requirements before you start work on a report, a project, really pretty much anything for that matter. When planning what your end result should look like, one of the first things to consider is the output format. I'm talking about a document versus a spreadsheet or HTML versus PDF. We're going to talk more about these things on the next slide, but I wanted to mention them first because defining the output format really helps to shape your thinking. There's a big difference between a table of data and a paragraph of text. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking more about composing and refining tabular data rather than the kinds of reports with a bunch of sentences on them. Once you have in your head the type of report that you're going to make, it's time to think about each individual component that will make up the report. Are we talking about tables? Then you're going to need to think about rows and columns. You can orient a table of data either horizontally or vertically, so let's just use the generic term field to refer to a certain type of data that you need to gather. What are the fields that you need to include in your report? Obviously, that's going to be very specific to the goal for each report. Let's take the virtual machine name as an example. Okay, the name of a virtual machine is very descriptive typically in your environment. Sometimes it might be your host name. Sometimes it's going to be functional. A virtual machine has an object reference tied to it. Every virtual machine has one of these, and it's exposed in a lot of API calls that you make with Power CLI. Look at this one here, virtual machine-vm-20. That's not a very useful piece of information to put in a report. Really, only the Virtual Center database sees this and works with it, and it's a very computer-centric piece of information, not something that you want to waste space with. You don't want to take up space on a report. So think about that when you're designing some of your requirements and specifying which field should show up on a page in a report. As promised, we're going to go a little bit deeper into output formats. When your goal is to automate the production of a report, which it should be, then you really need to keep in the back of your mind what sort of techniques are available for automating that sort of output. Have a look at this table. I've got some formats on the left and some techniques on the right that you could use to generate data in those formats. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into deep level of detail for each and every one of these. I am going to focus, however, on the ones that are marked in green here, plain text, comma separated values, HTML. Let me introduce you to some of these PowerShell commandlets and techniques. First, let's talk about CSV, comma separated values. You guys should be very familiar with these. Great input into a spreadsheet, no matter what sort of format you're working with. Usually it's going to be Excel if you're on the Windows side, of course. PowerShell has a couple of commandlets that you can use to work with these. Convert to CSV and export CSV. Convert to, if you remember from some of the previous lessons we've had on PowerShell, commandlet, you've got a verb-noun. So we've got convert to -CSV, export -CSV. The difference in the two, generally speaking, export means to take the data and place it into a new format. So in this case, it's going to go into a file. Now when you use the convert to, you're going to remain sort of in PowerShell in memory. So convert to CSV will produce the text strings, in the proper CSV format with strings quoted, commas between the fields, that sort of thing. If you want to work directly with an Excel spreadsheet, now you can use CSV as an intermediary, or you can use something called COM automation to directly automate Excel the application. We'll touch on this a little bit later on, but generally speaking, it's a bigger topic than I want to cover here. But what I want you to understand is that there is most everything that you can do in Excel, you can automate that with a PowerShell script. So keep that in back of your mind as in your toolbox. Realize you can change the color of a field. You can create a pivot table. There's a lot of options there. Another one that I'm just going to mention here, I'm not going to touch any as far as scripting goes later, is OpenXML. This is reference to the format used in Office 2007 and later that both for Excel and Word, there is a toolkit and an API that you can work with to create those documents. So it has nothing to do with automating the application, more about the framework for creating those documents. It's rather complex, but I've seen some really great work done with it here and there, and I will include links to those later on at the end of the presentation. Number 3, plain text. This is a really easy one, especially when a scripting language. Everything that you do, at least ostensibly, is text. You're working with text a lot. PowerShell makes it very easy to basically gather data and present it in a pleasing format in a plain text console. And sometimes this works great for reports, especially if it's something that you want to generate and send to an email. So we've got commandlets such as format list and format table, which are great for this. Format list is going to generate field line by line. Format table is going to orient these things vertically, so you've got columns of data. And we'll go into some detail about tips with working with reports and so on with there. Next up, HTML. We've got a commandlet called convert to HTML, and as you might guess based on how I told you convert to CSV works, convert to HTML produces the text that will go into an HTML document. There's some flags on it. You can produce just a fragment of HTML. So say that you've got a listing of data in a table. PowerShell will create that tabular data for you and give you the HTML that would surround it, and you can say, I just want the fragment there. Or you can produce the full HTML document, including the head and the body and all those things. So there's several different options. You can even tie in a CSS style sheet for your report. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with that commandlet. Next, Word document. This is the similar discussion as with Excel. You've got COM automation and OpenXML. Basically, the exact same thing applies here. If you would like to assign styles to paragraph headings, if you want to make things strike through, or change the line, the width between lines or the spacing between paragraphs, you can do all that stuff using COM automation. And lastly, PDF. Unfortunately, PDF is, how to put this? Let's call it non-trivial. It's not really easy to create a PDF document from PowerShell, but also Windows in general. There's more things you can do on the Linux side. There's Ghost script. Some of the stuff you can do on the Windows side, it's it may or may not be very elegant. There's actually a couple of .NET libraries which I've done just a little bit of research on. So there's some things that look promising. So definitely something that might be deserving of research on your part if this is an important format for you to use. So I'll include some links to resources later at the end of this lesson. Another aspect of reporting requirements is the report destination. You have a report on your hard drive. Now what? It's important to think about what happens next so that you can, of course, automate it. Let's talk about a few report destinations and some techniques that you might want to use to automate the delivery. I have an ever so fancy table here to show you email, file server, and web server. These are some sample destinations that you might use with some of your reports. For email, it's pretty cool. There's actually a commandlet which comes with PowerShell version 2 called send mail message. I'm going to pop up on the screen here PowerShell console, and let's check out send mail message. Okay, I just hit send dash and hit the tab key so that it would show me the things, they're using PowerShell tab completion, which is great. Put a dash question mark. Here's the help, just the summary of the help, really. So, pretty obvious what this commandlet does. And here are some of the parameters that we have. To subject, from body, SMTP server attachments. Got a few others, body as HTML. So what you can do is send an SMTP mail message, You can even use HTML in the body of the message, and you can include attachments. So this is all that you need really to take a report, and as a part of the the tail end of your scripting that generates the report, go ahead and send it out to your team or whatever distribution you want to send that to. Plenty of options there. We'll check that out a little bit more detail later on. If you want to take your report and publish it to a file server, that's as easy as just copying it as a file if you produce the report from the same location where the file server is. If it's a remote file server, then obviously you're going to need to have access to either a network share or perhaps in some cases a FTP or an SSH location that you could publish to. And that'll work for web servers as well. Now, PowerShell, you've got the ability to copy to different locations on your hard drive. Obviously, Windows file shares, very easy. FTP and SSH, going to take a little extra, few steps to do that. There's existing command line tools at which you can take advantage of. For example, ftp.exe, which comes with Windows. There is plink, which comes with PuTTY, which is a very popular Windows SSH-based tool that'll let you do secure copies. And there's actually some PowerShell commandlets out there that'll produce a more native experience for working with those protocols as well. There's a bunch of different options there. Now I'd like to talk about the value of interpreting data as you build out a report. What do I mean by interpret? Well, first of all, refrain from repeating data without adding value. So this is important when you're generating a report, especially for management or executives. They don't want to see the detail necessarily. So taking a large set of data and copying it from your screen into an email, that's not really helping. That's not adding value. So you've not really saved anyone any time or helped them to draw any conclusions. So think about every field that you put into a report before you put it in there and send it off. Make sure that it's something that's important. Some ways that you can add value include interpreting. So you want to be able to basically take the information that's input. Let's apply this to your virtual infrastructure. Let's say that you know that you've got lots of snapshots in your system that various people in the VI team have been adding over the last month. A report that just lists the snapshots is not as useful as reports that list snapshots beyond a certain age. Say that you want to, by policy, ensure that snapshots are deleted after 2 weeks. Well, a report showing snapshots older than 2 weeks is applying some intelligence here. That's going to help people out. That's going to provide a next action. So you can use logic like that to filter the data out and make it something meaningful. Another thing you can do is combine data from multiple sources. So think about where you have virtual machines, data stores. You've got information about data stores that you can't see necessarily while you're viewing the virtual machine listing in your Virtual Center GUI. Well, you take data from both of those things and say, I want to find out the virtual machines which have more than 2 disks, or I want to find the virtual machines which have disks that are larger than a certain size, or I want to find out something about data stores where I've got data stores, I have orphan VMDK files. So think about the intersection between 2 or more different sources of data. The point here is that you want to enable the reader to draw conclusions from the data. That's a key thing for a report. Otherwise, you're just talking about busy work. So some easy things you can do to kind of add value to a report is pretty simple. Add a percent column. Percentages are really easy to read. A lot of people can't look at a number, an integer, for example, and say, that's a good number, that's a bad number. But if you say, my percent utilization of my storage availability is very high. If I'm at 90% on my storage utilization, that's a big giant red flag, and everybody knows what that means. However, if you say that I'm using 1.2 terabytes, well, what if you've got 1.5 terabytes? What if you have 10 terabytes? Big difference in there. Adding a percent column will make that easily notifiable. Everybody can tell what that means right at the bat. So really, showing where the important data is indicate if you have any threshold violations. Those are things that add real value. I just included this as an example of, well, maybe going over the top. This is a four-dimensional scatter plot that I found on the internet, and the point of this is here, there's a difference between a report and data visualization. Now, don't get me wrong, data visualization is a pretty cool topic and something that I've played with in the past, but this is kind of a step beyond, and this is not necessarily what I mean. So you can talk about reporting without creating a single chart or graph. Now, it's easier to create a bar or a stacked graph or a pie chart, especially using some COM automation with Excel. There's some pretty cool things you can do. But don't get hung up in trying to produce the prettiest end result that you can. Obviously, if you have the wherewithal to create a four-dimensional scatter plot like this one, go for it. But I wanted to kind of, think of where your focus is and where the most value, the most bang for the buck. The last of the four parts which I mentioned earlier that make up a great report is automation. And this is really the key for many who are responsible for producing reports on an ongoing basis. All of the pieces that make up your report can be automated. If you can spend the time to do it right, the end result is that you have a reporting engine. The engine is a set of scripts customized to your need, which can do everything that needs doing to produce a report to your specifications. Another quality of a good reporting engine is that it's flexible enough to be used to generate a wide variety of reports. Now, I'm not going to build you a reporting engine in this video. This video is all about teaching you the concepts and giving you the building blocks. We will get to the code very shortly, but I feel that it's important to get everyone on the same page first. Now let's talk a minute about when to use Power CLI for your reporting tasks. I'm sure you've all seen this section of the vSphere client. You've got two reports to choose from here, and then there's a selection of things in the Performance tab to get statistics about different resources in your environment. Obviously, if we're talking about Power CLI, we're talking about VMware, we're talking about data that sits within your virtual environment. vSphere is, there's a lot of data in here, and Power CLI is a great way to get it out. If you have a need to customize or automate an existing report, by existing report, I'm just talking about these two here on the screen, then you can use Power CLI to do that. Now, what about needs that you may have, talking about things that are not in these two reports? Well, there's lots of things that are not in those two reports. And if your needs can't be handled by the existing reports in the vSphere client, well, you're either out of luck or you've got to go elsewhere. Power CLI gives you great exposure to the data in there. Here are just a couple of ideas of things that you might want to report on. vMotion capability, detail about your virtual machines, storage utilization. Maybe you wanted to make a security report about your vSwitch, and snapshot age, which we talked about earlier. This is the last slide before we get into the reporting scenarios, I promise. But before we do, let's build a sort of a map of the steps that are involved as we go through this process. First, you're going to gather the source data. PowerShell has a great set of commandlets, and Power CLI as well, that are working with data, pulling data out of an existing environment, and letting you work with it. Typically, we're talking about the get commandlets. Get is the verb in PowerShell that signifies that action of pulling data out. Next, interpret the data. There's a commandlet in PowerShell called measureObject, which does a great job of producing a couple of measurements out of the box. You've got sum, average, min, max, that type of thing. Of course, PowerShell has accessibility to any of a number of different operators and math functions, things that you haven't used since grade school. There's a lot of flexibility there, so you're not going to be missing anything. Next, filter, refine, format. We talked about some of these things. Select object is one that we haven't talked about, and this lets you choose parts of an object, parts of an output in order to then combine them later. Then we're going to be exporting data using these commandlets, which we talked about towards the top of the video, and techniques such as COM automation. And lastly, sending your report to the destination using commandlets like copy item or send mail message. So that's it. In this one slide, this describes the process that you're going to go through when using PowerShell and PowerCLI to create a report. Okay, now we're to the portion of this video where we talk about actual scripts. First up, host inventory report. The audience for this one is going to be system engineers, so we're going to need lots of detail, right? The requirements that I'm specifying up front are host name, version, number of virtual machines, some information about your CPU, information about memory, CPU model. This could be important when thinking about vMotion, right? And uptime. Now, some of these things are actually included in PowerCLI when you just simply run get VM host. So let's show a bit of a demo here. This is my live window, and I believe I'm already connected. Yes, I am already connected. But let's start from the top in case you haven't done this recently. Clear screen. Connect VI server. And let's specify some credentials. You don't have to actually type this. It'll try and use your Windows authentication. It's going to do a pass-through authentication. It'll attempt that, and if it fails, then it's going to prompt you. I know that it's going to fail in my case. So to save a few seconds of it trying and failing, I'm just going to go ahead and specify in there. Okay. Now I can type get VM. There are those. There are those. Okay, so what I did real quick, I just typed get-vm. There's my virtual machines. Same thing for virtual machine hosts. You can see I've got 3 here. 2 of them are connected and 1 is disconnected. That'll come back to bite us in a minute. I'll show you what I mean. We've got a couple of pieces of interesting information right up front about CPU and memory, so that's great. But let's pick one of them. Okay, so what I'm doing is picking one of the virtual machine hosts and piping that to the format list commandlet in PowerShell. This is going to spit out similar information to without format list, except that it is in a list instead of a table format. And there's several more properties here that are on display. State was already was in the above one. Power state was in the above one. Yep. A couple of these are not, though. Obviously, VM, swap file data store ID, swap file policy, parent ID, manufacturer. None of these were in that table. So these properties already existed on a VM host object, but the PowerShell formatting subsystem basically just hid them. And there are some instructions included with PowerCLI that says, hey, if I run VM host without any parameters whatsoever, let's just go ahead and put it in a table and display the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's display these 8 properties and use these widths for each column. But if you choose to format list, it's going to spit out all of those properties, even the ones that were hidden at first. So as you can see, looking at some of the things that we want to grab with this particular report, let's scoot this over. Well, what we have is CPU utilization total. So that's going to be your, basically all of your cores gathered together and multiplied by the right there. The current utilization, same for memory usage. Here's the CPU type right here, processor type. What I don't see, number of virtual machines. I don't see a couple of the other things that we wanted to check out. So that's a problem. It's a gap. We've got to figure out how to do that. First, before I show you how, I'm going to show you the results because I've got a script that I wrote. It's pretty short. You see, 844 bytes. I'll walk you through it in a minute. Let's do this. Get VM host. Pipe that to get VM host report.ps1. Notice that I did have to do a ./ in order to reference a script that's in the current directory. I'm going to run that, see what I get. This is taking about 5-10 seconds per virtual machine host is what I'm seeing in my lab environment. That, of course, is going to vary for yourself. Okay, so for each of my 2 connected virtual machine hosts. I got the information. Let's see. Average percent. That's one that didn't exist up above. Host uptime. So these are from my specification. I went ahead and did some work, did some manipulation to get these numbers. Number of virtual machines, here we go, it's 10. So let's look at the script. Here it is, but I'm going to go ahead and bring it up in my editor of choice so that I can scroll around and such. Okay, first off, let me say that this script went through many iterations to get to the state that it is right now. When I started out, for example, I didn't immediately have this bit up top in the param block because it wasn't strictly necessary to what I was trying to do. And a lot of this, I figured it out in the PowerShell console, just kind of typing in an ad hoc fashion. So you can definitely kind of, examine objects as you go, and I talk a lot about this in the vSphere Pro Series 1 video that I did about PowerCLI, so go back and check that out if you haven't seen it. But let's just go through this and I'll kind of explain what I'm doing. In the param block, this is where you specify parameters to a script or a function. I've got one. It's kind of decorated, you might say. This is the name of the parameter. It's VM host. So in PowerShell, to designate a parameter, you just use $VM host. So that's going to be the $. To call it a variable, basically, and name it. That's the only thing that was mandatory in here. I added all this other stuff, these attributes to the parameter to enforce some script, some choices that I made in my script. So first off, I'll explain this one right here. This is the Microsoft.NET class name for a VM host. Let me show you how I found that. Love the get member commandlet. That's how you explore your environment in PowerShell. Right here, type name, VMware Vim Automation Client 20 VM host impl. So that is how we found that out. What this does, this is called casting, or basically I'm saying that whatever I supply as a parameter to this script, it's got to be a VM host. If I type in, for example, the number 12, that's not going to cut it. So I'll show you how this works and why this is good in a minute. But basically what I'm doing is I'm enforcing this, I'm adding constraints to this script so that it's more robust. Okay, let's go to the previous line. All of this, this line number 2 and this portion here, line number 3, all of it applies to $VM host. Now I could actually put it all on one line, and it would be a little harder to read, but it would work just fine. So let me see, this part here, this is a new feature to version 2 of PowerShell. Don't try it with version 1, it won't work. What we have is some additional attributes that are attached to this parameter. First one is mandatory equals true. This is pretty clear. If you don't supply the VM host variable, PowerShell is going to freak out, or it's going to prompt you to supply it. This is adding to the robustness of this script. This second one is really pretty cool. Value from pipeline equals true. What this does is allow you to write a script that works more like a commandlet. What I mean is that it will sort of transparently handle whether you supply one value or more than one value, a collection of values, to this script. And it will also automatically kind of insert them in the script where I want them. So rather than having to worry about writing any sort of a loop structure in my script, I can use the pipeline and everything is sort of taken care of for me. But everything does get dumped into this VM host variable. Okay, next line, process. So I've got what's called a named script block. It's called process. There's 3 of these in PowerShell. The begin, process, and end script block. What happens is whenever you pipe something in PowerShell, like this, let me show you. 1, 2, 3, I can't count. Okay, so that's not an extremely exciting example, but what I've done here is I've taken a pipeline of 3 objects, each of them integers, and piped into the out string commandlet. That's just an example of a pipeline. So what I'm saying is, if I've got a script and I got big N, process, and then what's going to happen is that before anything is done to my, in my example, 1, 3, and 32, before anything is displayed, whatever is in between here in the beginning script block, that's what gets executed first. Then, in the process script block, all of this is going to run once for every item in the pipeline. So in my example here, whenever 1 goes through the pipeline, the process script block runs. When 3 goes through the script block, so on and so forth. So this is how I explained to you that the PowerShell will kind of take care of the looping here. I don't have to think about whether I've got 1 VM host or more than 1 VM host. It's taken care of simply by leaving things within the process block there. And if I have any scripting that I want to happen at the end after everything has gone through the pipeline, you of course will put that in the script block named end. But we're not doing that in this particular example. So where was I? We've gotten through the parameter block. Let's go through the contents of the process block here. First thing I'm going to do, and I told you that this was a key. You might recall that I had 3 VM hosts, and one of them was disconnected. Let me remark this out and show you what happens. I'm just going to hit up arrow a couple times, run my script again, and again it's going to take 5 or 10 seconds for each one of those virtual machine hosts to gather the information from my environment. There's number 1, and number 2 will come up in just a moment. Okay, and this is live data, so if you happen to have page the video backwards, you'll see that the host uptime does increment appropriately. Notice error messages. The metric counter doesn't exist for that entity. Again, the same error message. And this doesn't look too great. My host uptime is, what is that? 733,935 days? I don't think that is actually accurate figure. And all these zeros, that's not helpful. So, now for your purposes, for your reporting, you may want to do something different than simply continue, which is what I did right here. It may be very important for you to know if there's a virtual machine host that's not connected. I mean, that's actually pretty serious if you're in a production environment. But in my case, for this report, I'm simply going to just continue. And I did this with a quick 1-line if clause here. I'm checking to see if the state on the virtual machine host object is not equal to the text string connected. So there we go. That lets us carry on without any error messages. So these next lines 7 through 10 right here, these are sort of preparatory statements that I'm using later on. So let me kind of first introduce host prop. So this is what's called a hash table. Hash table, sometimes called dictionary in other scripting languages. That's indicated by the @ sign and the curly brace. Got an opening one right there, closing one right here. So in a hash table, you have a key and a value. My key is on the left, my value is on the right. And I just used tabs in here to make things very nice and pretty and readable. The white space is not important. Basically, as long as you've got a text string here on the left of the equal sign and any PowerShell expression on the right-hand side, you're good to go. So what I'm doing is using this host properties hash table as a container, and it's basically letting me kind of parse out some of the information which I already knew was in a VM host object. Let me bring my PowerShell window up again. Okay, so I have a single virtual machine host sitting in here. Let's send that to format list, also known as FL. So these are the names of the properties. So I'm able to access those in a script pretty easily. So note here, where is it? At the end, okay, name. So that's how I'm getting this. $vmhost.name pulls from right there. Same for version and all the rest of these. Version. Now, number of VM. That's not something that exists on this virtual machine object, so I've got to go elsewhere. I've done my homework. I happen to know how to do this. So let me give you some shortcuts here. What we have to do is to get a view off of through the VI API. So let's see. I think I have one. No, I don't. HV equals get VM host. Whoops. Okay. Pipe that to get view. That's going to take a moment. Not too long though. HV. Okay, now we've got a lot of stuff. Now I'm not going to go into great detail of this particular managed object view, but suffice to say there's a lot of stuff in here, and one of them is relationship to virtual machines. In fact, there it is right there, VM. So let's look at this a little bit. hv.vm. There they all are. Okay, so I happen to know by just instantly looking at the screen here that I see type and value. I know that this is a PowerShell array. And I know that arrays have a property called length. And let's check that out. So that's the answer to the question, how many virtual machines do I have on a host? And lo and behold, that's what you see right here. So that's where that came from. The next couple comes straight from the VM host object. We know how that works now, right? However, to get the average utilization percentage, I have to go elsewhere. So let's skip up to where this host CPU stat variable is defined, which is right here. Now this is a PowerShell commandlet, or PowerCLI commandlet rather, called getStat. I'm not going to go into it in detail at the moment because I've actually got another video that talks about it, which hopefully you'll see shortly. But what we're doing here is grabbing that virtual machine host, specifying that as the entity parameter, and then we're getting the stat called cpu.usage.average. Assigning that to a variable, we do the same thing for memory.usage.average, and that's where these come from. Host CPU stat.value. So the value property basically just contains that number, that integer, which represents my percentage figure. And then we'll get the CPU information, which we saw was on the VM host object. And then we'll go for those memory statistics and that memory stat that I had to grab using getStat. And lastly, host uptime. So this one, there's probably a few different ways to get this particular piece of information. But let's go back to that HV object and scroll up to the top. Notice a property called runtime. Let's check it out. There we go, boot time. Notice this line right here. Now the great thing about the way that this was structured is that when I go look at the boot time, it's a real .NET datetime object. That means that I can do all sorts of cool things to it. Notice that it's represented differently here and here. Now, there's some formatting rules that judge why that happened that way. But what is important to know, let's set that to get member. Whoa, a lot of stuff there. Okay, it's a system.datetime. One thing that you can do with system datetime objects is you can subtract them from each other. So if I have, for example, now, and let's say now minus, well, there we go. We've got, it's been 15 hours, 10 minutes, 41 seconds, 95 milliseconds, and some other types of representation of the very same information here. Now, what this is not a datetime object, it's a different one. Let's set it to a variable and look at it real quick. Pipe that to getMember, alias GM. This is a time span object. Now, I didn't like the way that the format was coming out, so I had to play around with this for a little bit. But if you look at what I've done here is exactly what I just showed to you. Now, over here, what I do is span.toString. So let's try that with my S variable here. I've invoked a method on the timespan object, and it just writes it out as what I thought was a pretty convenient one-line format. And this is something that is pretty fairly easy to read. If your system has been up days, which I hope it has, unlike my lab server here, it's going to be prefaced right there in the front. So it's going to be, for example, if you've got 10 days, and it's going to say 10.15:11:2. So we've got 15 hours, 11 minutes, 2 seconds, and then a fractional number of seconds right there at the end. So that is pretty much it for the meat of the script. The last thing that we're doing here is a really quick conversion of this host properties hash table into a PS object, otherwise known as a custom object. And this is basically, let's just say that this is an easier way in PowerShell to consume this hash table. Hash tables can be a little bit awkward to work with for some people, myself included. I don't like they're fast. There's some great things about them, but you can't use them the same way that you can use other things in PowerShell. So what I like to do, and this is a great little shortcut you can do in PowerShell version 2, is supply a hash table to this property parameter. You couldn't do that in version 1. The property parameter didn't exist, and there were other ways of creating custom objects, but it was a little different, not quite as straightforward. So that's basically it for that script. So let's get back to the presentation. Okay, report number 2 is virtual machine inventory. The audience with this one again is an engineer. What can I say? I am one. And our requirements are going to be virtual machine name, total memory allocated, total disk space allocated, number of CPUs, snapshot information. We're going to group these by the operating system of the virtual machine, and at the end we're going to send it out via email. So let's get to a console screen. We'll check this out. Okay, let me check my connection. I seem to still be connected, which is good. Okay, I have, here it is called getvmreport.ps1 right there. Let's go ahead and try it out, and then I'll explain how it works. Okay, I'm going to hit Control-C rather than let it finish and go through every one of them. Here are the fields that we've got output. Number of CPU, in this case, well, let's skip down. Okay, Vima, here's the virtual machine you guys might be familiar with. Nostalgia, most people know what that is if you've used the import feature in Virtual Center Client. So we've got snapshot size, 0 megabytes, OS name, other 2.6x for Linux, number of snapshots, disk kilobytes, memory megabytes. And you can see different values for different ones of these. What I'm going to do now is do the same thing. I'm going to pass it to format table. Okay. Now we'll be able to see more information on the screen. Now you can see there's a pause whenever it gets to a virtual machine with a snapshot. It's quite obvious because that's the time when it pauses. You can see the ones with a snapshot size of 0 megabytes will just fly right by. So bear that in mind when you're working with snapshots. Querying that information out of the database can take, a few seconds. Not a huge deal, but definitely something to be aware of. Okay, this has almost gone all the way through my virtual environment here. Notice I have a lot of OS2 virtual machines. I had to set them to something, and I figured I would, why not mess around with it. Okay, so here's the information we have. Let's compare this to what sort of information we wanted to receive. Okay. Now we have virtual machine name, that's right here. Total memory allocated, memory MB. Disk, it's going to be disk KB. Number of CPUs is right here. Snapshot information, we've got two fields here. Snapshot size MB and number of snapshots. And operating system is right here, but we haven't grouped anything. And then send via email. So last thing to do is to group this by operating system and then try to send it out in an email. So let's see what we can do with group. First, let me show you okay. Okay, that's the long help topic on format table. It's a pretty complex commandlet. I'm scrolling up here to the parameters. It's a parameters section. Let's go down to the G's. We just passed the one I'm interested in. Group by. Okay, here it is. Group by and then object. Arrange sorted output in separate tables based on a property value. A couple keys here. One is sorted, and two, property value. So what this means is we're going to have to specify the name of a property to group on, and we've got to have them sorted first. Let me show you both ways to see what happens. Okay, I'm going to do a group by OS name. Go ahead and hit enter. Okay, I'm going to Control C to quit that. See what we have here. Okay, so we now have a group heading right here, OS name of the 26 Linux, and I see one virtual machine, and then a different group name, Uh-oh, now we're back to the 32-bit. These virtual machines both have the same operating system name, however, they're not showing up in the right place. What happens is we've got to sort this first. Now, there's a drawback to sorting in that we will no longer have the fluid, the streaming nature of the PowerShell pipeline if you sort, because what happens is you have to get all the way to the end of the pipeline in order to be able to sort everything. It really kind of makes sense. But let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to sort by the same property name. I did it in a weird case. You can see by accident. That's not important. PowerShell, generally speaking, is case preserving but case insensitive, unless noted otherwise. There's a couple of exceptions to that rule. So, okay, so all I've done here is added into the pipeline a sort object and then a property name. Notice when I hit enter, nothing happens. That's because we're going to have to wait until the entire queue of virtual machines has gone through the report before the PowerShell sort object commandlet can take all of these values and then go ahead and sort them by that OS name field. But the end result's going to be worth it, as you'll see in just a moment. There it goes. Okay. Let me scroll up a little bit. Now we can see that things have lined up quite a bit better. So as you can see here, I've got several 2008 server VMs. And I've got one 2008 R2 VM. That's where my virtual center instance is sitting. And here's all those OS2 devices. A couple of other 32 bits. A couple of others. Here's another other. And a Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5. So we've achieved that goal of sending everything along this pipeline and then sorting it and then grouping it by the operating system. The last thing to do is send it in an email. I'm going to hold that for now. We're going to explain the script. I'll come back to it. But while I'm talking, what I'm going to do, this is going to be one of those little television cooking show tricks where I'm going to put it in the oven. You're going to come back, it'll be done. Let's say results equals, and basically I'm just going to take the results of this script and assign it to the variable. I'm going to let that run in the background. Now, first thing I've done new in this script beyond the last one is I added some comment-based help. This is a feature of version 2 of PowerShell where basically you can put things within a block comment. That's this little angle bracket followed by a hash sign. This is a block comment, so block comments can span multiple lines. And what you have to do is there's a few different tokens. They each start with a dot, like so. And this white space right here at the front isn't that important, nor is this. So what you can do is you can supply a synopsis, a longer multi-line description, and then each parameter you can give some guidance on the parameter. You can have more than one of these lines. And then you can provide one or more examples showing how the script or function or commandlet is used. And you can give a clue to the user what kind of input is needed. Here's some freeform notes field here. And lastly, we have links. And I'll show you how you can use this if you put a URL in the first link. There's a feature of PowerShell that lets you visit that URL. Okay, let's see what else we've done different. Some of this is the same you saw when we did the VM host report. I did add this that was new right here, alias. So our virtual machine is the parameter name right here, VM. But what I've done is saying that PowerShell will also accept virtual machine or input object as an alias to the VM parameter. Now, there's one more very important note to make. In fact, so that I would be sure not to forget myself, I've got a little comment here. Note the extra square brackets. These are the ones I'm talking about. Now, we did something similar to this in the VM host report, but I left those out, and it looked more like this. Just the name of the .NET type in square brackets. What I realized, though, is this actually led to a bug. What happens is, let me bring up my console. Okay, we've got that thing that's finished. What I could do is get VM host, pipe that to VM host report. That would work great. However, if I did this and supplied multiple VM hosts to the VM host parameter, it would actually error out. And the reason is that what I did was I told it would accept a single object of VM host type. In this case, what I've done by adding these couple of extra brackets, that says that I'll accept one or more in a collection of virtual machines. So this allows this other formulation of the command line here to work as expected, which is good. Okay, now looking back in the script, in the process block, we did this again in the last script. I had to do things a little bit differently because I added this block here to denote a collection of virtual machines. This meant that I had to be prepared in the process block to work with either one, because the VM variable could hold one virtual machine or it could hold multiples. So what I'm doing is passing it through for each object. That way it's going to be sure to iterate through each object right there in this virtual machine object right here. And then inside of the curly braces here, everywhere that you see a $_ that is represented by the current object in the pipeline, which is to say the virtual machine being worked on. So again, we're using getView to grab a server-side view of the object, of the virtual machine object in this case. And then we're also going to pass the virtual machine to the getSnapshot commandlet. And this will allow us to pull out some of the snapshot information, which I'll show you in a second. Name is a pretty easy one. Memory MB as well. Now, disk KB, this one's a little bit different. Way to actually go in a level deeper into the virtual machine to the hard disk property. Let me show you what this looks like. Okay, clear the screen. Okay, I have a single virtual machine in an object called $VM. Let's send this to format list. Nope, not format.com. Okay, now notice I've got about 10 properties here. If I add an asterisk to the back, I actually got closer to 20 properties now. That's just a little trick I want to be sure that you noticed. Sometimes those things can hide. Now, here is, we have the hard disk property. Note that on the right, we've got a text value here surrounded in curly braces. This means that the contents of the hard disk property is an array. It's going to be 0 or more items in the array, but it's definitely an array. See here we have floppy disks, floppy drives, but there's nothing in it. It's still an array. So we have to work with those a little bit differently. So let me look at it. Let's go to vm.harddisks. We'll have one item in here. And we can see capacity KB, so that if you can do the quick math, that's going to be, roughly 40 megabytes. In fact, let's do this. Now, this won't work. Why? Because it's an array. I explained this to you that it's different, so we've got to go and index into it. Okay, now we've got that number. What if we do this? That's in kilobytes. Let's divide it by a megabyte. Okay, so if we take kilobytes, divide by a megabyte, you get the number 40. So that is 40 gigabytes in this virtual disk's hard drive. Got a couple other interesting properties here. Persistent, and the full file name of the VMDK file. Let's go back out to our script, see where we were. So, I've explained where hard disks come from. Now we're going to go use the measure object commandlet and its sum parameter. What we're going to do is use that to total up the capacity KB. The benefit of using measure object is that it doesn't matter how many objects are in there. You can obviously have a virtual machine that has multiple hard drives. So if you send all these hard drives down the pipeline to measure object dash sum capacity KB, what is going to happen is it's going to take every one of those hard drives, look at the value in capacity KB, and add them all together. And then we can close this in parentheses so that it's executed, and then dot sum, that will access the dot sum property. Let me show you what that looks like. So I can just kind of do something similar to what we do in the script. Measure object. Now you can see by itself, without the sum parameter, all we have is a count. So it didn't really know what to do. Now, on the other hand, I've done the minus sum capacity KB. We've got a number here. So the way that you have to access that number is like so. And there's the answer to the question of the total amount of disk space consumed by this single virtual machine. That's basically what this line of the script does. Number CPU, that one's a straightforward one. Simply access the num CPU property on a virtual machine. Next up, number of snapshot and snapshot size MB. Now what we're doing here is similar. We're going to use measure object. This time we're just going to access the count property. But notice that I've surrounded everything in an if statement. During testing, while I was composing this script, I found out that if I didn't do this, I would get errors. What's happening is, if there are no snapshots in a virtual machine, then you're not able to count them. So if you try to run measure object against it, it won't return anything. So the count property doesn't exist, and you get an error message. So what I've done is I've just simply said if snapshot. So that's going to be this right here. If snapshot, if there is one, if there is anything at all in the snapshot variable, let's perform whatever's in the curly braces. Else, if there isn't anything in snapshot, return a 0. I do something similar in the next line. If there's a snapshot, let's take the size MB property and sum it all up together and return that value if there is one. If not, return a 0. And lastly, to get the OS name, okay, let's look at this. vmview config guest full name. I'll go back to my screen here. Okay, I showed you format list before. Notice a property called guest. See it right here? We do not see it up here. So this is one of the reasons that I showed you that little trick with the asterisk, because it was hidden. Let's access this guest property, this elusive guest property. Okay, now let's view this also in format list, asterisk. Lots of information here. In fact, this is the best way, and really it's kind of the only way that you can access the IP address of a virtual machine without doing things inside of the virtual machine. The guest object on a virtual machine object here is generated by the act of the virtual machine's tools service running inside of your virtual machine. You guys know what the VM tools are, right? You can install them on most Linux operating systems, all Windows operating systems, and these allow you to get a better integration between your hypervisor and the guest OSs. Well, they also provide some very limited amount of configuration management data back to the hypervisor. This property here, state, is running. This means that your tool service is running and it can communicate just fine with Virtual Center. Now there is an OS full name field here, but the problem is if the tool service isn't running, much of this data is not going to be available at all. Now, if you've looked at the vCenter client, let me bring up a virtual machine. Okay, here we have Lab VM 14. Guest OS is Windows Server 2008 32-bit. Now, I'll tell you right now, there's nothing on this virtual machine. It's just a dummy VM. In fact, it's only got 16 megabytes. There's nothing in there to know whether or not the operating system is up and running. And as you can see here, VM tools not installed. So how does it know what the guest OS is? The answer is, I told it so whenever I created the virtual machine. You guys have seen this. You can create a virtual machine and tell VMware what the OS type is going to be right up front. And of course, it needs to know this information because there's going to be a different network adapter and SCSI adapter sometimes used depending on your whether you're working with Windows or Linux. So you've got to provide this information up front, and that's what we're looking at. Okay, so this is that field here where we've said what kind of operating system are we dealing with. So what I'm trying to say is this information is stored in two places. Everything in this guest property comes from the tool service. But as I've proven, even if you don't have a tool service, you can still find out this guest ID and the guest full name property. So where does it come from? Now I'll show you. Let me see if I still have this around. I do. Okay. So VM view is simply VM pipe to get view. I'm not going to do it again because I've just got it sitting there ready for me. Now I've done the research for you again, and I happen to know that there's some magic stuff in the config property. Spell it correctly. Okay. Now we can see there's all sorts of cool things in here. One of them, guest full name version. So this is your the hardware version. What else do we have in here that's interesting? Guest ID, alternate guest name, annotation, tools, hardware. You want to get some information about the virtual machine hardware, it's going to be in there. Lots of good stuff in here. But the answer to the question that we're looking for is guest full name. You can see here it is spelled out very clearly. So this is the bit of information stored in the Virtual Center database, which tells me what kind of operating system would be on this virtual machine if it were booted up. Now the tools service can actually override the information that shows up in the Virtual Center client and in PowerShell, but this is the best information to go from it. Also, it's a lot faster to access. So let's go back to my script. You can see where I have the exact same construct right here. So then we take this VM prop hash table and convert it into a PS object and write it out. So that's basically it for this script. Let's go back to we had created, what was the name of it? I'm just going to scroll up in my history. Results, that's it. Okay, so we ran this report. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, so here's all the information sorted and grouped by the operating system as we saw before. So let's try and send it an email. I'm not actually going to do it because I don't have some of the network connectivity set up in order to get the email out of this box. But what I'm going to show you is, let me see, send mail message minus question mark. I talked about this briefly earlier in this lesson. You can see there's a lot of useful parameters up here, but basically all you have to do is this. Provide your email address. That is my real email address, like in case you'd like to contact me. Subject, a report from using the RFC format to specify the email address and my name. And then body is going to be results. That's basically it. All the other parameters are either optional or are not applicable to what it is that I'm trying to do. And if I do this, it's going to say what I need to do is to convert results into a string, because right now it's a set of formatting data. Let's pipe this to get member. See a big mess of things. The type name is Microsoft PowerShell blah 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 blah, format start data, group start data, lots of stuff that has nothing to do whatsoever with my virtual machines. However, when I copy it to the screen, it looks fine. So let's do this. String equals results, pipe that to out string. Same information. Let me clear the screen. Pipe that to get member. Now I'm working with a system string. Now if I scroll up a little bit, let's try this again. Okay, and that's exactly the error message I expected to get because I didn't specify an SMTP server name. Basically, you've got the answer to the question, how can I create a report and group it by the operating system name and then send it out via an email. Okay, now we are on to report number 3, storage utilization. We're going to look at data store, space free, and total space, number of virtual machines, break that down per data store, look at some statistics about the VMDK files and snapshots that are on these data stores, and I want to output this as HTML format. So that'll be something a little bit new. As far as the audience goes, this is going to be a little bit higher level. Let's call this one management as far as the audience goes. We're not going to spit out information on every single little virtual machine or disk file or so on. Let's go straight to the code. Actually, the demo I happen to have screen right here. Now I'm going to show you this in action, and then we'll go through the code just like we had done in the previous ones. First, I want to show you that the way that I tend to write my scripts, I like to make things very composable. What I mean by that is I like to make them in building blocks. So we've got the ability to take one command and use the pipeline and send it right into the next command. So I wrote my script with that in mind. So I'm taking an object from the vSphere API, this data store, and then sending it into my report. So what we're doing is just running get data store, which is a commandlet which comes with Power CLI. I'm going to run that against one of my data stores for this example, although it works against multiple. And then call that. We're going to use supply a path parameter, and I'll show you what that does here shortly. When I hit enter, notice that we've got reading snapshot data, and it said reading virtual machine data before that in this little progress indicator. I'll show you how to do that as well. It's kind of cool. And then you can see here where we've actually spit out some verbose text showing where the report was generated to. So let's pull that up. So here's what our report looks like. Nothing extremely complicated, but it does have a relatively pleasing style to the tables and so forth. So as you can see, that was pretty quick to generate. Let's do it again. This time we're going to run it up against multiple data stores. I'll show you what that looks like. So we're going to do the same exact thing, except instead of specifying SATA 1, I'm just going to leave it blank, so that's going to pull out all of the data stores. A couple error messages just because I don't have any virtual machines on a couple of those data stores. But you can see here it's taken a few moments to pull up some of this data. And that's mainly why I put in that progress indicator. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. I do have this sitting up here generated already. If we go to the top, you can see here's my local data stores. There's no virtual machines on it. Now, there's obviously some room for improvement in some of the way that we're presenting this information. For example, there are you've got, for example, the count of virtual machines on this data store, OpenFiler 1, and here's the average size of the VMDK files, but it doesn't say what this is as far as units. That happens to be megabytes, I believe. And we've got, this one just has a bunch of dummy disks on it. Same thing for snapshots. It doesn't really show you what this number means. So, there's some room for improvement, which I'll leave that as an exercise to the viewer. You've gotta have something to learn. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is to the report. Let's look at the code and what happens there. Let's bring up my handy dandy editor. So I've got it up here, and this one begins like the other two in that I've got a couple of parameters, and I've specified some advanced stuff here at the top to some attributes to the parameters. Going to make my data store. I'm going to cast it to this particular type, and you may recall that I used the getMember commandlet to get the to answer the question of where does this type name need to be. And I did specify that it's a collection or it's an array. So I've got those empty square brackets there. And we're going to make it mandatory. We're going to accept values from the pipeline. And just for the heck of it, I tossed in a couple of aliases. And one thing to remember when you're specifying parameters in a param block up here, you do need to make sure that you put a comma in between them. So I actually put this one on a line by itself just to make it very obvious. And the reason I'm calling this out is because I actually forgot to put the comma in between my parameters when I was writing this script. And the error that you get is, I won't say it's not obvious, but it certainly wasn't a 5-second thing. It did take me a couple of tries to realize where my error was. So that's a tip to be sure to remember to put your comma between parameters when defining them. Second thing I want to point out, I do use named script blocks in here. We've got begin, process, and end. And first thing I'm doing up here is, this is actually a search data store function which I built, and I ended up not using it in the report which I've just displayed to you. But it was such a good exercise that I went through writing the script. I really feel like I want to show that to you. So we'll do that after we go through the main logic of the script. But what I want to show you here is if you've got some code that you want to include from another file, here's how you do that. So first of all, you're just referencing the path to the file, and by itself that would run a script. That's how you execute something, in whether you're sitting at the PowerShell command prompt or in a script. But here's something new, and this is a dot followed by a space. This is called dot sourcing, and this is a concept which you, if you are big in the Linux shell, you might have seen this type of thing before. There are some other shells and interpreters that do something similar, but what this does is basically it executes this file in the current scope. So if you define any variables inside of this script, by dot sourcing it, you'll make those variables available in the current context, in the current scope. Okay, next thing I want to show you, this is a technique called here strings, and I've got an @ sign followed by a single quote. You can do double quotes as well, just depending on what you're doing. And here at the bottom you can see another a reverse of that, a single quote followed by an @ sign. Anything in between, you can basically make yourself a multi-line string and assign that to a variable. And it's pretty helpful when you're doing something exactly like what I'm doing here, which is I just had a bit of template HTML that I wanted to have at the top of this variable, and you're going to see in a minute what I'm doing with it. But this was a great way to build out that text rather than going through multiple concatenation operations to produce this result. This was a nice little shortcut to do that. So let's go ahead and collapse the begin script block and open up process. And remember how I showed to you that this was a very composable script. I can send things to it in the pipeline. Again, the way that you do that is you put things in the process script block, and then you can iterate through them very easily. And it saves you a lot of time and effort when you're generating your script to use this value from pipeline equals true, and then you use the process script block. And it's very, very kind of seamless for you. So let me maximize this so you can see everything on the screen. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're working with data stores. So that's why we have the get data store commandlet and using that to send information into this script. So this is where it lands. It lands in the data store variable. Just in case someone has specified multiple data stores on the command line, let me show you what that looks like again real quick. That would look like this. If I did export data store, get data store, if I did that, that would return multiple data store objects. So we have to be sure to treat those as such in PowerShell. So that's why I wanted to be sure that I would take whatever's sent to me and then iterate through each one of those. So first thing we're going to do, and you can see I marked this script up pretty well. In case I didn't mention it, all these scripts, they are on the DVD that you're getting from Train Signal, and I believe they're made available for download on their website as well. So you don't have to type these in. First thing we're going to do is gather the data, followed by producing the report. So in this gather data section, I've got a bunch of write progress lines. You can see one each here, here, and here. And this is what produces those little status indicators at the top of the screen as I was running the report. So there are two required parameters for the write progress commandlet. I went ahead and tacked on a third one just for the heck of it. But you can kind of see this is more or less self-explanatory what we're doing here. You're explaining what the current operation is, the activity that's happening, and I chose to put in a variable substitution here so that we can basically say, hey, I've got 10 data stores, I'm working on data store X right now, and that will change the next time that it goes through this loop. And then just a simple, working, if you could say your robot voice there. So that's how write progress works. It's and there's actually, if you like to get a little bit more into it, there's a lot more information about this commandlet. You can, for example, use a for loop and supply some values to the %complete parameter here, and it will actually give you a %complete bar along the top, and you can have that kind of scroll through, 10, 20, 30, 40%, so on. So there's a couple extra neat features in there. Moving on, all we're doing here in this first section is getting the virtual machines on the current data store. So this is how we're filtering. We don't want all the virtual machines. We want the scope defined just to be the ones on this data store. And we're assigning them to this VM variable. And then let's write another progress indicator. Now we're going to determine all of the virtual machine disk files for all of those virtual machines. So the way we do that, we take this VM object, which we just assigned, and we pipe this to the select object commandlet, and then give it the expand property parameter, and then hard disks. So what this is doing, I'm going to show you this in this console here. Okay, let's do the exact sort of example. I'm just going to do all the virtual machines for the heck of it. But let's pipe this to select object, expand property, hard disks. Now I'm going to do first three, so that way it's not going to fill up the entire screen. Okay, so what this did, it's actually kind of going into the VM object. Let's look at VM. I'm going to look at the first virtual machine. This is my first virtual machine. It has a hard disk property. Okay, here it is, hard disks property. You can see there. So let's look at the hard disks. Okay, so this first virtual machine in my collection has hard disks, and looks like it's got two of them, two tiny little hard drives, and here's the full data store path name to these two hard disks. Now if we scroll up to see what happened, that's exactly what we see here. If we look at the second virtual machine, actually let's go over here, I'm just going to change this 0 to 1. I'm at the bottom of the screen here. You can see, here we go, Lab VM6, and it's got one hard drive. If I scroll up, I'm going to see Lab VM6, and then there's the one hard drive for that. And if I go to the next virtual machine, you would find that it's 10. So, to explain this a different way, I've got virtual machines. Each of those has hard disks, and the expand property commandlet looks at each one of these objects and then goes in and grabs the property name that I specified, which was hard disks. So I'm taking those and assigning them to the disks variable. And then I'm going to do some measurements on them. So I'm going to take those disks and pipe them to measure object commandlet. And now let's do this real quick. Disks equal VM, pipe that to select object, expand hard disks. Okay, that takes a moment, doesn't take too long. Okay, now disks, pipe that to measure object, not command, measure object. Okay, now we're going to, let's see what we've got in the code here. Capacity KB, I can actually just copy and paste this here. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at this capacity KB property, which has got the size in kilobytes, obviously, of all of these VMDK files. And I'm going to do a few different things to it. I'm going to get the average, min, and max. I hit enter. Here's the answer. So it automatically brings up a count. So I've got 35 VMDK files in all of my virtual machines. The average size in kilobytes is here. The maximum size in kilobytes is here. That corresponds to 40 gigs. The minimum is here. And it's telling me that it measured this based on the capacity KB property. So measure object is a tidy little commandlet which basically gives you a couple of little statistics in a nice package, and you don't really have to worry about doing the math. Obviously, everybody knows how to compute these things, but this is a nice shortcut for doing so. So I take those statistics and I'm assigning them to this variable, and I do something very similar for snapshots. So I'm taking the VMs in my data store, pipe that to get snapshot. That's going to show me the snapshots only for those virtual machines. Assign that to a variable, and then I get some snapshot statistics exactly the same way I did for the VMDK statistics. We're going to skip over this commented part for right now, but we'll come back to it. Now, we're going to make this HTML report that I mentioned before. I'm going to insert a couple of headers in here, and if you know any HTML, this is no big deal. And what we're doing is using an operator called we're going to assign and then add at the same time. So we're taking, this is a shortcut for saying HTML equals HTML plus. That's what the plus equal operator does. So HTML is, from our begin portion here, this is what's in the HTML variable. So I'm going to add to it my header, and then I'm going to start taking these objects that I created here, such as my data store object, and running them through the convert to HTML commandlet, which I mentioned earlier in this video. I'm going to supply the fragment parameter, and this way it's just going to produce only the bit of HTML required to convey this data that I'm asking it for. So I don't want it to put in the the HTML tags, the body tags, any of those surrounding parts, because I've done those manually myself. Although if you're just going to do take one object and convert it to HTML, leave off fragment and it'll produce all those other bits for you. So what I'm telling it here is that I only want to have it output these three properties and as a table. So I could say as a list, and it would actually orient them differently in the HTML output. So do this again with producing a little bit of intermediary text. Now, what I did here is I'm looking at the count of the virtual machine objects. So again, we're talking about per data store. So notice that this is a string, which everything in between these two quotes is a string. What I've done here, this is called a sub-expression. Anything between $1 and a couple of parentheses, you can insert PowerShell code in between here. So sometimes this is a useful way to do a small bit of processing. There's a couple of different stylistic reasons you might do this as opposed to doing it a different way, but I felt it was appropriate and didn't really get in the way. As an alternative, you might have seen something like this. Let's say HTML equals my report for data store colon quote plus data store located on plus ESX. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. You can use this same sort of method in PowerShell. I just chose not to for whatever reason, but there's so you can concatenate strings like this, or you can do what I did, where text here, and then inside the sub-expression do something here, and then continue on with your text without having to stop the string, or without having to get into any of this concatenation, which I've done here. So a couple of different ways of doing the same general thing. So where were we? We were in this sub-expression right here, and nothing new here. I just did the same thing again a couple times, and I've ended it with a horizontal rule to kind of break up some of that output. Let's look at the end script block real quick. Very simple, just closing off this document. And then I'm running this through the set content commandlet. And basically this just takes the contents of this variable and puts it in a file. And I've specified the path to the file here using the path parameter. And I put in verbose. You may recall, let me see if this is still on the screen. I'm going to scroll up here. No, it looks like I cleared the screen. When I run the report, which I'll do again, one of the quick ones. Okay, when I run the report, after it gets done with the, this bit in the yellow, see where it says verbose, performing operation such and such, performing operation, and it shows me this path to the file. This is I'm not going to say it's on 100% of commandlets in PowerShell, but it's on a vast majority of them. The ability to supply a verbose parameter, as I've done here. So if you supply that parameter, well, guess what? You're going to get some verbose text. So this is a very common convention in PowerShell that you'll see. So that's basically it, and I did that, and that kind of saved me from having to worry about writing some extra bit of information to a log or anything. I've just let PowerShell write that to the screen. Okay, so that's basically it with our script, but before we end, I did want to get back to, I promised you to talk about this search data store function. So let's load this file, do it this way. Okay, it actually got rather long. This was one of those things where I thought I would just really quick write a quick function, and it was 8 lines, and I've got to do this too, and then I better do this too, and it turned it into something that took most of an evening to produce, and that's okay. It was a great example, a good exercise, and a bit of code that I hadn't touched in a little while, so it worked out well. But what I wanted to show to you was that this is an example of doing some things with the VI API, some a little bit more complicated. And I want to show you that there's really not a whole lot you can't do. You do just have to, there's more to it. You have to get a little more involved into learning about the VI API. But there's really a lot of cool things you can do. So what I've done is provided the ability to search a data store for any file. And you can provide a file spec such as star.vmdk, for example. So I'm going to walk you through this briefly, and then I'll show you an example of how it works. So this one is, again, it operates on data stores. And so we've some of the other parameters we're working with are the file spec and a couple of options here for basically how to return the data. And something new that you might not have seen, switch. So this is basically a Boolean. If I supply the as folder parameter, then it's set to true. If I don't supply it, it's set to false. And here, actually, what I'm doing is I'm setting the as ds path parameter to true up front. So you don't have to do anything. This one is quote-unquote already on. So I'm going to skip down a little bit. We've got dsView. This is where I'm going to take the data store that's provided to the script and run that through the getView commandlet, which is that excellent commandlet which comes with Power CLI. It's kind of the release valve. It lets you get at the VI API and do a lot of cool things. Now, the way that you search a data store is by executing basically code against the host server. Data stores themselves don't do the searching. It's the host server that does the searching. So I have to pick a host server connected to the data store. Now, obviously, if you've got some shared storage going on, then there can be multiple hosts connected to a data store. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the dsView object, which I just grabbed a minute ago, and I'm going to go to the 0th or the first host object there. So this is how I'm selecting the first ESX server. And then what I'm doing here is I'm creating a searcher. I'm going to create an object, it's data store browser, and that's something that I use here in a minute. Now, this is a sort of convention that you'll see a lot in the VI API. In order to do something, you've got to create a new object, and then you assign properties to that object. So this is something done very frequently when coding against the VI API, whether you're doing it in Java or C Sharp or PowerShell. So you might wonder, where did I come up with this object name? How did I know this stuff? And the answer to that question is, well, number one, I some of it's experience, right? I've been working with it long enough. I kind of had some hints and I knew where to go. But really, there are some good tools, and I wanted to show you real quickly the API reference. So what I can do actually is, if I know that I want to work with a data store, well, let's say a data store browser, I can go over here to the API, go to all methods. Actually, I think that was actually the wrong one, but let me see. I'm going to go down to, this is the good one, search data store subfolders. So this page of documentation, if you know how to read it, will show you all the information you need to know. And there's a trick to it, and I'm not going to go into it in detail here. Maybe we'll save that for a later video. But there's a lot of good stuff in here, and this tells you all the properties that you need to supply. So I kind of went backwards. I knew that I wanted to search a data store. I searched the documentation, found the method that I needed to do that, and then it's telling me, hey, I've got to provide a search spec. So I click on here. Let's see, what the heck is a search spec? Well, here's what a search spec is, and I've got to supply to it a match pattern. And by reading this documentation, I can see what a match pattern is. So that's where I came up with this object name, basically. And I've specified a match pattern. And that match pattern is, for example, as I show here in the comments, star.vmdk. And this file as well is going to be provided with your videos, so you'll be able to mess around with it. So I go through here and I'm modifying further options to control what sort of information is returned. I'm telling I want to return the file size, modification date, and then I'm actually doing the search right here. Now, what I'm doing is invoking this method on this object. So the DS browser, let's go back up a little bit. DS browser is something that's based on, as I told you, the host server. So we're going to the data store browser of my host server and invoking this method, and we're giving the data store path, which is, you can see these in ESX or in the vSphere client, and the search spec, which is star.vmdk, for example. And I assign that to a variable for the output, and then I do some fancy things here to kind of control how the output looks. So that's basically all I want to show you there. Let's see what that looks like in action. Okay, I do have search data store here. Let's see if I've got star.vmx. Hold on a second. Let's do ds equals get data store SATA1. Okay, now ds, and let's do file spec star.vmx. Hit enter, and this one does take a little while. And if you've ever worked with the browser and the vSphere client, this is exactly what it is doing in the background. Exactly, it's executing these same methods, it's running the same sort of code against the VI API. Now, what you can see here is a full a data store path name for these files. So if you went to the data store browser and I went to SATA1 and then opened the nostalgia folder, I would see nostalgia.vmx. Let's do another search. I'm going to change the spec. Let's do star.iso because I happen to have some ISO images out there. And we'll say that we're going to get this one as file. Hit enter. And again, this will take 5-10 seconds. Here we go. You can see I've got several ISO files. And the output is different because I said that I wanted it as file. But this allows me to get the file size and the modification date. And there's a bunch of other stuff you can do with these particular API calls. If I wanted to, I could say that I want to search for snapshots, and then I wanted to search for, maybe I could search for VMDK files, but only the ones that are thin. There's some other options that you can do in there. That's basically where I wanted to go with that little subsection there, talking about searching of data stores. Let's get back to our slides. Let's do a little roundup of all the topics that we've covered. First section, we talked about how to create a great report. Very important to know who your audience is. And be sure you determine your requirements up front. Very important. We talked about lots of different output formats and some techniques that you can use to write to HTML. Report destinations, such as sending an email. How it is important to interpret your data. Don't just lay down a repeat of what you already know. Add some value as you're going along. And of course, Power CLI is all about automation. So if you repeat it, script it. We talked about when is Power CLI useful reporting. Obviously, whenever you need to get data out of vSphere. It's a great example. And there aren't a whole lot of reports built into the vSphere client, so there's lots of opportunities here. And use Power CLI to create reports. There's a lot of great commandlets built in with included with Power CLI or built into PowerShell. A lot of great options here. And then we went through reports number 1, 2, and 3 for hosts, virtual machines, and storage. I just barely scratched the surface, as I'm sure you've probably got some thoughts buzzing around in your head of reports that you'd like to create. There's the field is wide open. There's really a lot of stuff you can do here. I hope you found what I have provided to you very useful, but I thought, why don't I send you home with a couple of other extra things. We briefly talked about Power GUI before in one of my other videos, And the reason that it is on this slide here is not just because I like the program and what it does, but specifically to VMware PowerCLI. They've got a VMware Power Pack, which lets you query some great information out of PowerCLI, and it's all based on PowerShell. So you can kind of look at the source code to see what they've done, and that'll just help you even better in your learning process. Here's a link to the VI SDK documentation, which I showed to you earlier. So our resource number 3, PowerShell Data Visualization. This is a blog entry by a guy named Doug Fink. He's a PowerShell MVP, and he's done some cool things that I wanted to have you check out. And Power Gadgets, this is a neat application. These guys have written some controls that let you basically take PowerShell code and generate these nifty little gadgets, dashboard applications, gauges, buttons, graphs, a lot of cool stuff. This is a commercial application, a lot of examples out on their website, which I've got a link to. Poshboard. Now this is a really cool website and tool. It's basically a Silverlight application with a WYSIWYG interface. PowerShell is all behind it. You can basically take anything you can do in PowerShell, you can have that information output to the screen and then integrate it into the different controls that it provides. And there's a lot of neat stuff in here. Go check out some of the videos on the Poshboard website. There's some really amazing things that this guy has done, and this is actually a free product. Yeah, live updating graphs, all kinds of cool stuff. And here's a blog post from Chad Miller. It's titled "Making Graphs with PowerShell and PowerBoots," and he shows you how to grab some information out of a SQL database and using an open source tool called PowerBoots to produce some really nice looking charts as well. So there's a bunch of different options for doing some of these types of things. And this last one is a code sample which I found on PoshCode. I've not checked this one out personally, but it looks pretty straightforward compared to some of the things that I've done. And this one is specific to VMware. That's why I wanted to include this one here. And it uses the Microsoft Office web components to generate charts. So you do need to install those before you run this script. And you can see here that it's using COM automation against this COM object and calling all sorts of methods and properties to create. And but you can see right here, get data store. So you guys know this commandlet, right? No problem. Some good stuff in there. Anyway, I hope those resources help you out, and I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Thank you very much.